Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, maybe even early evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. Welcome to day 2 of the Garden and the Dump, a conference on the multitude of ways of thinking and living attentively and ecologically through visual art, cinema, magic, and philosophy. Our conference is concerned with a twisted ecological, historical, and ethical space we find ourselves in that open, ambient, distorted, and mysterious gap, or perhaps even a scar between gardens and dumps. We are in the middle, as Michael Marder put it last night. So as many of the speakers in the conference, both yesterday and today, remind us, art, philosophy, fiction, and architecture are all important to understanding our relationship to non-humans, to grasping our ever-present yet ambiguous relating to the more-than-human world.
We're very pleased to see you all here again, and we hope that you had a chance to join us last night for Marder's and Morden's presentations, and we have many more incredible speakers in today's program. In addition to the roundtable in just a moment and the conference speakers a little bit later, we also will be presenting our own research, Aliya and I, as part of our ongoing PhD programs, and we will also, of course, very much appreciate any feedback that you think might be helpful for us. But before that, we're very excited to welcome Chen Qiufan, Aliya Bucknell, and Nicolai Chan for a roundtable discussion on the workings of eco-sci-fi and world building through speculative fiction, technology, magic, shamanism, and much, much more.
Nicolai and I are just going to give very brief and very warm welcome to Alice, Angela, and Chan. And they're going to, at the beginning of their panel, they're actually going to speak more about the projects they're currently working on and the interests which are definitely overlapping, and a lot of them that they share. So starting with Alice. Hi, Alice. Alice is an artist, writer, and educator. Based in London most of the time, but I believe she's in Riga right now, aren't you? Mm-hmm. She works primarily with video game engines, and her work explores interconnections of architecture, ecology, and magic, as well as the non-human and machine intelligences. She uses speculative fiction and world-building strategies to critique architecture's role in the climate crisis. This year, she organized New Mystics, a platform for exploring the interconnections of magic and technology. And I'm sure she'll tell us more about this project. And she exhibited her work, her video work internationally, including at Bloomberg New Contemporaries, Nottingham Contemporary, Venice Architecture Biennale, Ars Electronica, and Tomorrow London at White Cube. She's also a writer, and she writes regularly for various publications, including Freeze, Moose, the Architecture Review, and many others. Moving on to Angela, who is also an artist, as well as an independent researcher and curator. Her work reconfigures power in relation to the inequity of climate change through self-archiving, rethinking geographies, and speculative fiction. And really, speculative fiction, I should note, is perhaps one of those overarching interests for all of our speakers. Her current research and art commissions span climate framings, water scarcity, and conflict. And she has held residencies with Arts Catalyst, FACT, Jerwood Arts Digital Fellowship, and Sonic Arts Environmental Research Residency. Angela produces curatorial projects as Worm, Art and Ecology, and she's also co-founder of a London Chinese science fiction group and a co-director of London Science Fiction Research Community. Welcome to Angela.
And Chen Qiufan, a.k.a.
Moving on to Stan.
Chen Qiufan, a.k.a. Stanley Chan, is an award-winning Chinese speculative fiction author, translator, creative producer, and curator. He is honorary president of the Chinese Science Fiction Writers Association and has a seat on the X Prize Foundation's Science Fiction Advisory Council. He's garnered numerous literary awards, including Taiwan's Dragon Fantasy Award and China's Galaxy Qingyun Nebula Awards. The Fish of Lijiang won a Science Fiction and Fantasy Translation Award in 2012, and The Year of the Rat was selected by the year's Best Weird Fiction, Volume 1. More of his fiction may be found in Invisible Planets. Liu Xijin, China's most prominent science fiction author, praised Chen's debut novel, Waste Tide, as the, quote, pinnacle of near-future science fiction writing. So we're, of course, super excited to have you all here today and to talk about your work. And I guess I'll just leave the floor to you.
So who's gonna start doing the short introduction? I think lady first, maybe. So
I'm happy to go. So we have a little plan to maybe spend 3 to 5 minutes introducing our works to people who might not be super familiar to our practices. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion to really kind of get into the depths of what we're really interested in and see how we overlap with our work. So unless someone would like to nominate themselves, I'm happy to just give a very quick introduction to what I get up to. And let me just give you some illustrations to show you what I'm talking about. And so, as Aliya mentioned in my introduction, I am quite focused on climate change as my main area of research as an arts practitioner. And for a number of years, I've been running this curatorial project called Worm Art and Ecology. It started off as a website with interviews with different climate-focused arts practitioners, built up into a project that produces exhibitions online and in gallery, as well as working with youth groups, talking about climate communication, how we tell our own stories. And so it was kind of my beginning into getting to know and understand different perspectives of climate change. And throughout this process, I've been able to kind of like build up my own strategies or my own models of working in order to communicate climate change to audiences that might not necessarily have engagements in the arts or even the climate discourse, both of which actually have quite similar templates of systemic barriers to certain groups of people that might not be in a dominant mainstream discourse. And so working with people who are activists, grassroots climate justice activists, as well as artists and cultural practitioners is really important to me. Working with a global perspective is very central to my work. And here are some kind of quick shots of gallery and online interpretations of a recent exhibition. And yeah, as introduced, I also have my own arts practice. And so I'm able to have opportunities to really go into depth with the research ideas that I've had on my mind for quite a number of years. And it's only recently in the past year that I've been able to spend time on this. And earlier in the summer, I produced my first video work, which was really exciting. This one's Export Explode. It's focused on this nature reserve at the Thames Estuary, which Wat Tyler Country Park it's called, which is a bird watching site, but it's also the site of the former Pitsea Explosives Factory. So I look at the British colonial production of dynamite, how back in the 1800s, the end of the Industrial Revolution, dynamites were produced and exported from England to the rest of the world through the empire, through the colonies, and through the empire's allies, and how this really sets into place the technological, ideological, and commercial frameworks for the current arms trade as we know it today. And so thinking about extractivism, climate change impacts, but also the power struggles that play into this conversation, it's really important. So nature reserves aren't always neutral. Later on, I'll be doing an environmental research residency with Sonic Apps, and I'll continue this research into conflict and climates, specifically looking at the environmental pollution of ammunition, specifically with tear gas, and how the long-term environmental impacts is something that is still a growing area of knowledge. We are starting to really understand the human impacts of tear gas, but the environmental impacts, what's interesting me specifically is how it affects water systems, how that then affects the people who are originally protesting social and climate injustice, who are most likely to then also receive the inequitable access to safe, clean water. So thinking about pollutants and water systems is something that's upcoming. And I have a really keen interest in comics and drawing. This is part of an exhibition contribution that I opened yesterday at FACT Liverpool, where I have been a fellow for the past several months. And so the Rain Paradox project is a title taken from the Great British Rain Paradox, which is a report that came out last summer, sponsored by a dishwasher tablet company, supported by the government's environmental agency, and it warns us of the water scarcity crisis that the UK will face in 2 decades' time. But it really focuses on the household consumer, the individual responsibility, talks about growing population in a quite problematic way, without being transparent to communicate the states and corporate accountabilities and responsibilities to communicate what climate change is doing, what impacts it's having, and really kind of neglecting the responsibility to tell us of the state deregulations of water access and I guess like cleanliness around the country. Every river in the UK, every river in England is polluted. That was another report that came out only a few weeks after the Great British Rain Paradox. So my kind of version of the survey that they did, which was 2,000 responses across the UK, was that I interviewed or had what I call living room conversations with different people, community-focused practitioners who are very familiar with their local environments and I guess like local communities as well, to talk about water stories, water beyond a commodity, but as a vessel for migratory dynamics, one that has healing properties, one that has spiritual and cultural, I guess like powers. And so I think it's important to think of this as a way to self-archive stories that are kind of not archived by the government's official website. And I also co-direct the London Science Fiction Research Community with several others. And this is a screenshot of last year's conference, which actually Stanley was a part of. And yeah, I kind of want to finish by mentioning that I co-founded the London Chinese Science Fiction Group. We read in English and Chinese. And yes, I'll hand it over to another presenter to talk about your work, and then we'll go into a nice discussion. Alice or Stanley, would you like to share something about yourselves?
Yeah, I guess I've been pinned, so I don't know if that's a sign. Okay, I guess I'll go. Yeah, thanks, Angela, for that really generous introduction. It's nice to see more of your work, and the new comics project looks amazing. I look forward to talking about it more shortly. And yeah, thanks, Aliya and Nicolai, for the invitation. It's really awesome to be here. The three of us obviously have such like incredible amount of overlap in our work. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I will briefly be talking about my practice. I'm just gonna go ahead and share the screen. So yeah, as was mentioned earlier, I'm quite interested in architecture's relationship to speculative fiction, and I actually come from a background in architecture criticism. and urban anthropology. So I've kind of been, interested in architecture like across a few different disciplines and like times in my life, I guess. So one of the first like video artworks I made was also quite recently because my writing practice, predated my art practice. So this still that you're seeing right here is from a project called Easy Crypto Build. It was essentially about cryptocurrency speculation and architecture's fetishization of technological utopia. So it was, definitely a riff on Silicon Valley, but also the Starchitect complex that kind of governs a lot of post-global architecture with the production of international cultural institutions and museums. We talk about the Bilbao effect, like the ways that architecture can basically be a source of cultural capital. And I basically, like for this project, it took the form of like a speculative fiction narrative where it was set in the kind of near future and the apocalypse is nigh, and there's kind of a new vein in the market for post-apocalyptic luxury survival bunkers. So the idea behind Easy Crypto Build is that, like there's these like celebrity architects who've been enlisted in this like design sweepstakes to pitch their idea of a technological utopia. I like made its own cryptocurrency called Crypto Build. The coins that you see here were like laser cut acrylic coins. Actually, like the photo shoot is from my hometown of Sarasota, Florida. But yeah, the project kind of, it's definitely quite satirical and comedic and pokes fun at like particular celebrity architects like Thomas Heatherwick or Dame Zaha Hadid. But ultimately, it was interested in kind of using speculative fiction as a way to kind of unpick architecture's power complexes and the ways that it kind of monetizes and exploits disaster narratives and like disaster capitalism to kind of world build its own incredibly egotistical like visions of the future that are highly inequitable and really only built for the 1%. So that's that project. This is a still from Swamp City, which I released only a few months ago. And it takes a sort of similar narrative, but at the time that I made this work, I was, very interested in kind of, well, I guess two things really. Going back to my home state of Florida, I was interested in the Everglades as using the Everglades as a kind of environment, because I feel like the swamp is such an amazing metaphor for hybridity and kind of collectiveness and also contamination. And I just felt like it was a really rich environment to speculate on yet another sort of near future architectural apocalypse. And this project basically imagined, climate change has gotten increasingly bad. Like the west coast of the United States is on fire. The East Coast is underwater. Really visions that aren't too far from what we've already seen in the news over the past couple of years. But kind of imagining the Everglades being tapped by a sort of luxury eco-tourist developer to become the site for a new luxury ecological development. So it's sort of, targeting the 1% who is, kind of having an existential crisis because the world is ending, and it's offering them essentially like a chance to fly into the Everglades on their like eco jets and to reconnect with nature. And it's kind of focusing on this like enduring, quite like colonial myth of the Everglades being this site of like raw or like untapped or unadulterated beauty, but also something that's quite ferocious that could like, kill you. Like there's, pythons and alligators everywhere. So yeah, that's that project in a nutshell. It's also like Easy Crypto Build. It's built in Unreal Engine. I work primarily in game engines to kind of construct these speculative worlds and to kind of lend a really rich environmental and architectural like dynamic to them. Third up is New Mystics, which was briefly mentioned. It's kind of a pivot, but also kind of not. It was the project I worked on this summer, and it's close to coming to an end, actually. It's been a series of texts that have been co-written with the language AI GPT-3. I can talk more about that later, but as like a kind of elevator pitch, it's the most powerful neural net ever built. It's been trained on everything published on the internet up until 2017, and like every digitized text ever. And yeah, it's I really liked the idea of using it in a way that was kind of like wrong, or to sort of like fuck with the function of it a little bit. And to do that, I kind of developed a Python script that would basically alter the output of the text, so I could like increase its like creativity and also increase the length. The developers of GPT-3 basically never want people to go over 2 sentences in response, because they don't know what the AI will come up with. They haven't like foolproof that. But I was using it working with 12 artists, feeding GPT-3 a conversation about their practice and about their work that I had with the artists, and then kind of asking the AI questions. And its responses were like thousands and thousands of words, and we're getting incredibly psychedelic and trippy and mystical. And I mean, GPT-3 is a lot of things, but I think the most interesting thing to me is its like lack of understanding of disciplinarity, or siloing certain forms of knowledge into particular categorizations. It doesn't think in that way. People argue if it thinks at all, like, I don't know, that's kind of up for debate. But in that sort of black box of unknowability, like how the AI is kind of creating the memories or the artworks that it talks about in this project, I was really inspired to use it as a kind of oracle that kind of helps me co-write these texts along with these artists. The artists are all individuals who, you know, work a lot with magic and technology as is. So it felt like a kind of interesting collaboration and extension to that line of thought. And yeah, there's 3 new texts published every full moon. The last 3 will be published on the autumn equinox next week. And I'm sorry, I know this is taking me a little longer, but finally, this is the current project I'm working on. It's about Mars and language and magic and fungal colonies and Elon Musk and colonization strategies and terraforming and science fiction and resource extraction. And it's kind of this incredibly like convoluted tentacular thing at the moment, but because it's going to have multiple kind of worlds cohabiting the planet, but not really ever interacting. And it's built in Unreal as well. And I've been working to develop a new language based on a Martian script that was written by a French mystic in the 19th century, as well as Scottish Gaelic. There's a very interesting connection between Scotland and Mars. I don't have time to go into it, but this project is definitely focusing on that. And the extruded landforms you see back there is actually a 3D model of, or it's like data mapping from the Scottish Highlands. So yeah, there's a lot going on there, but it's like early days for the project, but I felt like it would be fun to show you guys where I'm at right now with it. And yeah, that's it. Thanks. I'll stop the share.
Cool. Thanks, Alice. Like and Angela, all your sharing is so fabulous, and a lot of things actually tap in my interest for sure. So thanks, Aliya and Nicolai, to have me here. I'm gonna share a little bit of what I'm doing and my views, which during the last decades. So my title is From E-Waste to Techno Shamanism, the Hidden Reality of China and Beyond. So actually the book Waste Tide was written actually 10 years ago. It's like in 2011 and published in Chinese in 2013. and going to other language like English, Germany, and Spanish in 2019. So it's like 2 years ago. So actually is setting a fictional place which is based on a real location named Guiyu. It's just 60 kilometers away from my hometown. Is at the coast of southern East China. So it's since 90s, it was the a recycling of e-waste center in the world. So it caused a lot of like environmental issues like soil, water, air, pollution, and also a lot of blood disease for sure. So you can see a lot of like shocking scenes there. So that triggered me to write a book. And it's funny that because in reality, after I published the book like in 2018, actually Chinese government launched the law of banning like 24 types of foreign waste, including electronic waste. So Guiyu actually had this kind of like transition into a more eco-friendly, more healthy, and lower like pollution environment for recycling. But meanwhile, like worldwide, actually a new revolution on waste is happening. So for example, on Philippines, so there's huge protection go against the Canada trash importation is, I think it's like just 2 years ago, and worldwide the inequality of like waste collecting and recycling is become a major issue. So for now, I can see there we need to bring this kind of technologically breakthrough to solve the problem. Otherwise, like there's no anyone else's backyard for these developed countries to dump. So as you can see from this picture, like for United States, like over 90% of the electronic waste was shipped to other countries like Asia, Australia, and also I think Europe and other places. But now, like when you throw it away, think about there's no away because the earth is sick. Because like after I published Waste Tie in 2019, so there came the pandemic, and we're actually in this process, a very painful and isolated process, I think. So it actually gave me a lot of opportunity to rethink about the whole thing, not only from a very technologically perspective, but also from a broader view, because as everyone might know, China is a pretty materialistic country because our education system, our ideology is pretty much based on materialism. But during the last year and this year, actually, I got this opportunity to visit a lot of exotic place like Inner Mongolia. I try to understand the ritual and the shamanism all around China in different areas. So I think Inner Mongolia is a new way of returning of shamanism happening in the last decades. I think partially because of the exploitation of the environment, because all these mining companies, they dig around and they try to destroy the soil, the field, and causing a lot of climate change in that area. So and as my interaction and comprehension with the shaman there, I kind of understand the worship of shamanism is towards the nature for sure. Like they worship the river, the holy mountain, the holy trees, and all this spirit of animals. So it's a way to respect the nature. So I think it's coming back. It's a dynamic change. It's a structuralized change in in a bigger way. So this is something I also attended in Dali and Wuxi and other places in Guizhou. So it's mostly tap into the culture and tradition from minority. So it's totally different from Han narrative. So you can see a lot of diversity there, like biodiversity and cultural diversity and language diversity, which is, I would say, vanishing, undercover the majority of Mandarin and Han culture. So I'm doing a lot of like field study, and also this is something happened just late last November. So it's called Sanxingdui. It's like a civilization back in 3,000 years ago, but right now the whole country is invest so much resources and technology, the most advanced equipment to dig out this ancient city. So because it's so interesting to me is like they try to rebuild the whole set. It's actually a shamanism ritual. So it's like celebrating the god, and this king also, he's the shaman, and also he's kind of the leader of the tribe or the nation. Actually is so advanced, so they can using the technology to build up this bronze bowls and huge trees, etc., etc. So right now, I think the whole country from top down, they try to create this kind of new narrative of China as a multi-origin but single identity nation. But I'll put up a label here, shamanic nation. Why I'll talk about later. And this is something happening in the city. So this is the one of the most famous performance artists, Shen Wei. He actually like create this kind of huge show, which you can see is quite Western, Westworld style. Like all these best dancers, they are working around and they improvise in a way that connects to the spiritual world. So because he mentioned by himself, he got a lot of inspiration from I Ching and Dao De Jing. So it's all about connection. And this is something is happening right now. It's a big exhibition in the new Pudong Art Museum. So it's by the famous Cai Guoqiang artist who using firework to create this kind of work. So actually he described himself as a shaman. And also this is something like really bring the rituals into our daily life. This is an event which inviting all these ordinary people to join us to experience the music, the process, the dancing, the performance, and drinking a lot of like herbal teas or wines under this kind of shamanic drums. So it's happened in Shanghai. So I was thinking about that because right now, like Wu, which in Chinese means shaman, actually is the medium of connecting the planetary material, information, and beings, which its function is replaced by so many technology nowadays. But in a historical reason, it goes into a more accelerationist direction, which drives us towards the cliff of dystopia future. So right now, I think in China this year and all around the world, we can experience this kind of extreme climate change. And also Chinese president, he can acclaim to this kind of carbon neutrality goal in 2060, and also to build up this ecological civilization as narratives. So I'm thinking about actually we are just putting backward of the technology towards to reconnect to the tradition of shamanism, which is more sustainable and eco-friendly, and also we are looking to a more spiritual dimension, no matter on all aspects. So actually, this is why I create this term called Techno Shamanism, which means we have to build up this kind of new consensus that technology is not only going this rational, scientific, and materialistic way, but also you need to tap into, like James Lovelock mentioned, like the Nova scene. We have to blend it into different dimension, like spiritual level, like animalism level, like all this ancient, traditional, cultural level, to try to build up this kind of new civilization. So, and this year, I just got my new book, AI 2041, coming out, co-authoring with Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. He's the expert on AI. And this book is set in 10 different countries worldwide. So I would say this book is not only about AI technology, but it's more widely tapped into the culture, indigenous people, climate change, because I think it's more relevant, and how we can leverage technology as a tool, not to maximize its scientific and rational function, but how we can leverage it as a mirror to reflectively seeing ourselves, what's behind our humanity, what's behind our bias and discrimination and short-sighted. So I think this book could be a good conclusion for my first stage of writing. So I'm thinking about right now, it's time to going back to the mythology. It's time to reconnect to the shamanism. It's time to bring more spiritual elements into the science fiction narratives. So yeah, so that's because we're in the process of transition from the first order cybernetic society to the second order cybernetic society. So I list out just a lot of like theories and names here. I think you're more aware of this and better than me. So I'll stop here and I'll leave the conversation to further unfold what we're all interested in, and I'm definitely sure there's a lot of things we can collide and we can inspire. Maybe we can co-work together. Yeah, so I'll stop here and give it back to the floor. Thanks.
Thanks, Stanley. That's amazing to hear. And also, Alice, your work. Great to hear all the different lines of development that we're all trying to kind of like, integrate with the changing world. I invite anyone to kind of like comment in the chat as well, because Alice, Stanley, and I are going to have a discussion. We are likely going to miss out a formal Q&A because of time restraints, but any comments or just quick questions, like we welcome them anyway. And hearing both of your hearing both of your presentations, one of the main things that I think about is how we're looking both into historical kind of excavations, quite literally, Stan, what you talked about in uncovering this ancient city, and also Alice, talking about how we're situating ourselves in this moment to project what's going to happen in the future. This also combines into my work of looking into climate science and seeing how those projections might, or probably very much will, unequally affect certain demographics of people. So how do we anchor the way that we communicate certain types of stories and make sure that those who are already very compromised don't fall into the trap of being maybe aestheticized by institutional co-option of, intangible cultural heritages, shamanism, indigenous practices. All these things are very sensitive, especially when there's this urgency to rush into like a solution to find something to save us from climate change, rather than talk about the political struggles that's, is so in our face, is so evident already. We need to remember that Indigenous voices do not have the right to vote at the UN. And so we can have COP summits, we can have all of these political world platformed conferences, yet if those who are protecting the earth the most, the longest, are not given the rights, how does kind of our narratives recenter or help to kind of educate ourselves, help us unlearn certain things that only state and corporate narratives are feeding us? Invite you both to respond.
Yeah, so I can take that firstly, and Alice might jump in later. And I think for me, it's quite obvious. In China, like most of the sci-fi readers and audience, they are still trapped in the golden age back in the 1950s, 60s. So they might have this kind of very strong binary mindset on science fiction narratives, like hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi. So actually what I'm doing is try to, I would not say sugarcoating, but to build up this connection between, or you mentioned like shamanism and indigenous knowledge and practice with somehow like scientific discourses, and make it more coherent and make sense to the current audience. And also for the state level, they would love to see how science fiction as a genre can inspire younger generation on technology and innovation, for sure. So I think it's how you positioning yourself, like not just go binary, either science or either like mystical, but I think on certain level they are coherent. But the way is how you build up this world, how you build up your narrative, how you finding this angle to cut in. So you don't try to pick anyone off, but you can create something beyond their imagination in the previous experience of science fiction. So I'm actually reading a lot of like myth, folklore, and also fairy tales. I think definitely there's so many wisdom and so many archetypes there, so we can leverage.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I'm happy that you brought up the hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi binary, because I feel like that's something like really crucial to this conversation. I mean, of course, like, you know, like H.G. Wells-esque apocalyptic visions of aliens landing on the earth, and like a lot of like, yeah, like white male sci-fi authors flexing over like how specific or how accurate or how scientific their visions of the apocalypse are. That's obviously like, that has sort of been the sort of status quo of sci-fi in the West for so long. Meanwhile, of course, we have people like Donna Haraway, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, who, I mean, I agree with them. And like, I think that the binary of being like called like someone working in like soft science fiction is like really, I don't know, like problematic in many ways. But I also think it's important to acknowledge, I guess, you know, and I think the evolution of speculative fiction as a term does that in a lot of ways already, but acknowledge the ways that the science and speculative fictions can be used not as like a predictive tool, but like a descriptive tool. So, I mean, of course, like Ursula, like, you know, a lot of her work is set on like far off planets, but ultimately it's describing like social, political, cultural conditions and conflicts that are deeply central to life on Earth. And then of course, you know, like texts that like the carrier bag theory of fiction, which is again thinking about technology as not this kind of linear progressive device, but as an art of storytelling, or as a space where abstraction and maybe like, yeah, kind of mystical or alternative thinking, mythologies, kind of uncertain or untold histories can and should be put on the same like dialogue and same conversation as ideas around technology and science and ecology. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely important to kind of think about the ways that technology and magic or mysticism or ritual can coalesce and coincide. And I mean, one thing that I think about quite a lot, and like many of the artists in New Mystics, you know, are using quite advanced technologies like generative adversarial networks or language AI, but kind of fucking it up in a way, or like messing with it to sort of disrupt it from whatever like human oriented task it's supposed to complete. Like artists like Zach Blast, for instance, or Yana Sotela, ways that you can kind of explore what's termed as like the black box condition or the black box effect in like discussions around artificial intelligence. You know, it's like we don't really know how the machine or how the algorithm has arrived at the thing that we've asked it to do. So maybe instead of like having the spotlight on the final, this like idea of like a final product or like this like progressive kind of production of a quantifiable object or thing to use and monetize, it's like actually maybe shifting towards the process. And I don't know, like hanging out in that space that's impossible to understand completely or impossible to fully know. That's where, yeah, my interest right now is like definitely kind of in that like that swamp of unknowability.
Sticky swamp. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's like the disruptive process that you mentioned importantly needs to situate itself in the activism that we're trying to foreground as well. And so, you know, I noticed in the chat, Peter asks like, so is your, you know, how do you kind of place your artwork as a sort of activism? And returning to what we were talking about in terms of like soft and hard sci-fi, I agree that's not a really helpful binary. We need something that is much stickier, something that is like in the in-betweenness of confusion and process and unfinishedness. Because, you know, a lot of the I got a little bit of feedback. A lot of the things that we're contending with in terms of global crises, those are unfinished business. It's unfinished histories that are exacerbating a lot of the political struggles around the world. And so if we're thinking about how do we disrupt those processes, we need to kind of think about, well, okay, this is how I could kind of like can contribute to the soft and hard sci-fi. I think it's more useful to think about who is telling those narratives. You know, are they people who are already very grounded in their local or regional or cultural kind of like spaces that are steeped in activism? I think about Grace Dillon, an Indigenous writer and editor who we invited to our LSFRC conference just last week, and who edited this amazing anthology of Indigenous science fiction called Walking the Clouds. And I'll link it into the chat for you to look up. And where, you know, inherently these stories are political because it's about, you know, the people, the planet. You know, soft and hard doesn't quite capture those nuances and, you know, beyond SF kinds of stories whereby this is about science, this is about technology, whether or not it's hard or soft. It's also a way of thinking about, oh, do we trust, you know, the Western imperialistic, you know, climate sciences of, you know, academia more than we trust traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples? And so what actually constitutes as, like, I guess, criteria to qualify that type of knowledge? And I think that seeps into the ways that we want to tell our stories. How grounded into the, I guess, like facts do we want to kind of shape our stories to communicate the untold facts to the wider public. I think it's a responsibility that we have with quite public platforms to capture these stories and work with activism, not in replacement of, but to do it in alignment with. Alice or Stanley, would you like to mention anything about maybe the activism and practices that you have?
Right. So actually in China right now, I'm working with some artists who was pretty young and focusing on the environmental issues. So actually, one of them, they collecting the heavy metal from the soil of Guiyu, which I mentioned earlier. It used to be the e-waste recycling center back in the day. So this is it might stay pretty long, like hundreds of years to get rid of it. So he distract all this metal and make into some kind of installation and artwork. And this is one way we make the exhibition, the art show, to educate the people about the urgency of protecting the environment. And also I'm writing a book on like carbon neutrality for kids. So because our country, like China, set up this goal is like 2060, but I think for most of the people, like adults, they're actually not caring enough, because they are, I think it's beyond maybe their lifetime. So I think the most importantly is have our kids, our younger generation, to understand what the situation now, what's the big aim after all this action, and what kind of daily behavior should be changed, and what kind of value system we need to build up. So I think that's something I'm working on, and I think it's totally relevant.
Microphone, Alice. Thank you.
Alice.
Okay, sorry about that. But yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sam. I think in my practice, like a kind of large issue that I focus on, I guess, and this is like, quite specifically, when I talk about it from an architectural perspective, but it's definitely like a bigger issue across corporations and like national public policy, which is this issue right now that we have of greenwashing. And I think in architecture, it's like especially problematic because it kind of feeds into this like technological utopian like concept or fetish that a lot of architects have, which is like, that if we design green buildings with like, like a green wall, or if they have solar panels, or they're carbon neutral or something, it's like justifies this like continual production line and just like, mass spanning of like luxury apartments or zoning regulations that like completely change a city and will like price people out of living in an urban environment. And I think a lot of like architects kind of try to hide behind an idea of greenwashing, and they use a lot of like very trained and kind of impermeable language, like really opaque jargon, and yeah, like again, these like false statistics of carbon neutrality, like equaling goodness or justification for building in like an incredibly accelerationist rate, and for a very specific group of people like who can afford it. And I think that a lot of my work, like both in Easy Crypto Build and Swamp City, is really trying to take that language and that kind of hubris, I guess, that a lot of these architects build with and talk about and work with, and trying to like puncture it a little bit and bring that dialogue or discussion back down to earth, and present it in a way that, you know, maybe when people are walking around a city and they see yet another construction site with like glistening renders of a green roof, or they hear that like Google or Amazon wants to like build their next like headquarters in their town, it's like something that can be treated with a bit more suspicion or like awareness, maybe, that there's, you know, more than meets the surface or more than meets the eye to like these glittering, beautiful buildings. So yeah, I think that in my work, it's definitely about like wanting to kind of take these discussions that are dressed up with really fancy language and ideas around like ecological salvation that maybe are intentionally designed to be exclusive or to make people feel like they don't have a role, or like they can't contribute, and like all of this is being decided above their heads, kind of thing, and kind of bring that into a kind of a narrative and a sort of like, I mean, yeah, like a speculative narrative, but also something that is quite relevant to the present and picks up on you know, contemporary conversations and events and ideas happening now, to kind of have a sense of urgency to it, even though it is speculative. But moreover, just like trying to make those ideas a bit more approachable or like relatable, or something that people feel like they can have an opinion on. Like it's not, you know, something that exists like way above their spectrum of control or understanding, which is so much a thing that architects use. It's like, yeah, being around them for 10 years now, you see the ways that they've developed an entire language to exclude people, like exclude a general public. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's value in being able to have proximity to some of that in order to kind of witness and critique and further foreground the voices that we actually do want to stand by. Quite similarly, I work in international climate and cultural policy, and currently co-authoring a report that will go to the UN COP26. And seeing how cultural ministries around the world deal with environmental policies or not with their own cultural policies is very kind of, I guess, there's a lot to take in. And so how for me as an arts practitioner, working with a lot of grassroots climate activists, how does that then translate to the power dynamics that people are experiencing in trying to even gain access to go to COP26? You know, people are just, you know, talking about the very obvious problems of like, well, there are no kind of like affordable accommodations in the area while the talks are going on. How do we even go there when we're in the same country or we're traveling up from London? And yeah, Stan, would you like to say a bit about, you know, your backgrounds and how you kind of intersect with different sectors, and then we'll work towards closing up the conversation as well. It's very
right. Yeah, I think I'm right now taking the place just like a shaman. So it's like a medium to connecting all these different agencies. So for example, I will have a conversation with the government, with the scientists, with the tech giants, and also with the public, to the audience, to the kids. So I'm thinking about like this is a whole lot of translation process. You have to speak in their language to make them understand what is the biggest pain point, and you have to take in their shoes and thinking what they really want. So for their sake. So yeah, but ultimately we try to create this consensus, like we bring everyone together to create this kind of future, and which is more sustainable and more eco-friendly and more balancing compared with the past. So I think all I can do is very limited, but I think step by step. So we are gathering a lot of people, intellectual and influence people. So, and young people, I think is quite important here because they are the thought leader of the future. So I'm quite confident that in the next few decades, we can take over the power and we can definitely shape a better world in all aspects. So that's my hope.
Great. Thank you, Aliya.
Thank you for your fascinating conversation. And I'm glad that we actually managed to finish on a slightly optimistic note. I'm afraid, yeah, I'm sure there were so many more questions to ask. And I guess the only alternative to us not having time that I can suggest is that on our website, gardendump.com, if you look at the biographies of our speakers, they actually listed their contact details on social media and their websites. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to, you might have. But I'm gonna just thank Alice, Angela, and Chen so much for the conversation. And we're gonna move straight to the next session of the conference. Thank you, and I hope to speak to you soon.